Hi, Hani. It's great to see you.
Ben, wonderful seeing you. How are you? And Hans, wonderful to see you.
Hi Ben, hi Hani, it's great to see
Well,
you.
Hani, I'm going to hand over to Hans Ulrich soon, but just to link these conversations within the context of the healing arts, I wanted to ask you about how the last year has affected the practice of architecture.
We all of a sudden lost a certain kind of traction, a certain kind of habitual way of working, run-of-the-mill way almost in terms of just the rigmarole of it. And all of a sudden this crazy vacuum, and then we find ourselves in a very different situation where it was much more meditative and insular across the whole profession. I've watched a sort of leveling and a back to basics aspect that's actually been extremely healthy for the profession of architecture. We've gotten to ask very serious questions again about why we do what we do. Dealing with clients and dealing globally has become a much more efficient situation. We don't waste a lot of time and a lot of carbon moving around, and we get to the point. That's been interesting.
To what extent was mental health and the consideration of mental health built into the architectural process anyway?
Years ago, we did a fascinating installation piece at Castle at Documenta 11 with Oakley around the themes of Jona Friedman and Constant, who were great figures in our discipline and great historical characters. It was an augmented reality piece. And we took a mirrored room. We mirrored the room ourselves. We built out a room. And we put these kind of strange tubes in the room, and we projected video that would actually allow these tubes to turn. We didn't think about it in terms of mental health, but what it was could we create kind of video derives of major urban metropoli and capture somehow the phonetic madness of these places, the behaviors within high-end modernist landscapes. And so we took Tokyo, Hong Kong, New York. People sampled voices in elevators of people speaking to each other in dialogue. And then we took those voices and sampled them and then resampled them into a sound piece, used them and had the projection of these cities play those symphonies. And what came out was a kind of really interesting set of musical, kind of Cagean musical scores that picked up on something of the behaviors of these places urbanistically. And ever since then, I've always thought that cities and the way we design cities have an amazing impact on mental health and on the way we think and the way we act. I think in an abstract way, urbanism and mental health has always had an intrinsic link. And I think as architects, most of us would believe in the sort of doctrines of people like Vitruvius, who said that, beautiful cities make for beautiful people. It's interesting that this idea of beauty in a larger context, and that comes into art and music, can actually act in a positive way for the people who experience it. And I think architecture is not immune to that. A well-designed city, a well-designed urbanism, a well-designed architecture probably has a great deal to do with betterment.
That's great. At this point, I'm going to hand over the baton to Hans Ulrich. And I know that this is a continuing conversation, isn't it? This is by far means not the first conversation you guys have had. So I'm going to hand over and let you continue your fascinating conversation now. Thanks, guys. See you soon.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ben.
It's great to see you again. I think we met exactly 30 years ago, and I always remember the journey to the Engadine, to Pontresina.
Mind-blowing experience, and I've thought often about all those things that we covered in that 3-hour drive.
And today, as Ben said, we're going to talk about architecture and, of course, the importance also of architecture giving hope. I mean, Gerhard Richter once said that painting art is the highest form of hope. And I suppose we can say that also for architecture. And you have often talked about that, and in relation also to, of course, the big theme of mental health. You've actually referred to history, that there is a long history in a way for many, many centuries. You mentioned Vitruvius, who already talked about dignity, beauty in relation to cities. Can you talk a little bit more, following up on what Ben and you discussed about this long history?
Always been an absolute parameter for us as architects historically to work on architecture and its kind of symbiotic relationship to the human condition. You can cite Vitruvius as you just did, and we just did, but we can also go all the way up to Corbusier and discuss, plan voisin and green cities and the notion of sort of building in the park. We can look even now into the contemporary let's say, obsessions and interests we have as architects of really trying to find ways of creating healthier, more sustainable, sort of smarter, more intelligent architecture, even utilizing technology. So I think there's a fantastic continuum from the sort of, let's say, the birth of architecture, the primordial HUD, if you will, all the way to the world we're in today. We are absolutely committed to trying to understand and envelop and create for environments for the human condition in all of its kind of facets. So mental health is by far one of the major facets there, if not one of the primary ones.
There is a long history, and of course at the same time there is a new emergency actually of the issue of mental health in relation to the isolation, to the lack of togetherness of the last 12 months. And I was wondering kind of how, with your architecture practice, you answered or can answer to such an emergency. How did the way you work change?
One starts to realize the absurdity of some of the things we took for granted as architects in terms of large gathering spaces, the airports. That's one of my pet peeves and one of my pet sort of obsessions these days. I mean, the obsolescence of the airport to me is fascinating, because you have places like Fraport or Frankfurt Airport, which is basically a city unto itself. How do these spaces now reconfigure themselves according to some of the things that we've now picked up from this COVID experience that are valuable to us as human beings? And social distancing and things like that is part of it. But what's really more important is the notion of healthy, accessible and scaled environments in which we can basically operate and work in, and desire to be part of the architecture, desire to coexist with your city and with your buildings. Those things we've taken for granted. And in fact, to tell you the truth, it all sort of came to the surface in a very powerful way now, because you have to also ask yourself about the relevancy of certain kinds of buildings in the aftermath of this. And we start with typical things like office space, but also the domestic space is going to change dramatically. We have an entirely different relationship to domestic space now.
I want to ask you, tell me a little bit more 30 years after about your interdisciplinary pursuit, the importance of it to address these big questions, where you see it now.
I was thinking this morning, there's this fantastic book called Asymptote by Canetti. And in the book, Canetti describes this character who walks through the library and has an amazing library and has discussions with Dostoevsky and with Husserl and with Kant, and has these fantastic kind of dialogues with these ghosts, these authors of these books in his library. And I was thinking that that's really, for me as an architect, I'm living in, I exist in a kind of auto da fe world with artists. We're working at the moment on a project in Hungary, and we've become extremely interested in the op art, in the history of op art, and the way op art has come to us through Hungary, through Vasarely and others, and how it kind of through the kind of conduit of Paris, and the question we've had as architects is the sort of psychological landscape that art has allowed us to, that it performs, and how it performs optically, and can it in fact raise one's kind of psyche and spirit by virtue of being inside the sort of, let's say, the kind of spatiality of op art. And we've become actually pretty obsessed with it, and we've been building these kind of crazy op art inspired structures. And the thing that's been interesting is and it goes back to the mental health thing in a kind of peripheral way, but the sense of well-being and the sense of centeredness and the sense of understanding, ironically, can be manifest with things like spaces that are optically, sort of playful and are dealing with phenomenological things that we didn't quite understand before. And one of the things that I cite when I think about that is that there's been studies made that, people literally feel better in forests, right? That you are in a natural landscape. I know you're in Switzerland, so you know this better than anyone. But and the question is, what is it? So of course, the scientific side of that is the scientists will tell you that it's the oscillation of the trees and the glints of light and the kind of, the general kind of atmospheric thing. But the artists might say that it's actually the fragmentation of light and the disconcerting nature of being in a kind of a oscillating, ever-changing liquid environment, right? Those are kind of more artistic ways of describing that. And to me, that's really the crux of it, is to find a way to say, well, how do we then, in the built environment, create things that mimic emotive sort of kind of understanding of spatiality when you can sort of replay. And I think that's what we discovered in op art. Op art actually is nature. It's actually nature manifest in geometry, and it's fascinating.
Hani, you mentioned actually three things which are important: cities overcrowding, the repeating of and cookie cutter mentality as it applies to places for incarceration, hospitalization, and the aging. This is a quote from a text you wrote. And you said that these three aspects of the built environment are in dire need, or one could even say in urgent need, of complete overhaul and total rethinking. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Places of incarceration, places of hospitalization, and the way we deal with the aging in our society are three things that we have, neglected, honestly. And the qualitative is very, very important, and I think would bring a massive upgrade to those kinds of places if, in fact, architects were asked to work on them from the point of view of what is it to make these places human.
I think the question is, when we talk about prisons, is of course also the idea of abolishing prisons.
The idea there is not so much to design yet another prison or another prison paradigm or an efficient prison, but how not to design them, how to design non-prisons. In other words, can we get to a point where we could design things that would serve what prisons are supposed to serve, which is the sort of betterment of the human being, the reform, bringing them back to some semblance of normalcy or whatever that is. And rather than the road we've been going down for a long, long time, centuries, is this idea of confinement and closure, and somehow that's going to solve the problem, and all it does is increase the problem. So you're absolutely right. I mean, the abolishment of prisons is the sort of utopian ideal, but somewhere in there, to meet that ideal, I think we have to start to really think about the design of non-prison prisons.
How can hospitals be reinvented? How do you see that?
So we became very interested in that. We did a big research studio at the Unwritten in Vienna with my students there. And what we discovered, one of the biggest things we discovered about hospitals is that they need to be atomized, for lack of a better word. And by atomized, I mean that we have to move away from sort of the singular institution, the sort of, the big building block, the hospital, be it in the city or outside of the city, to things that are much more to do with clinic-like approach, but to do sort of micro hospitals that are interconnected. The thing that became really interesting during the pandemic here in New York, hospitals couldn't communicate with each other. There were too many beds in one place that were available, and there were no beds, and people were being turned away in another place, but nobody had a way of sort of monitoring the whole sort of ecosystem of the hospital landscape. It's really interesting when it comes to architecture, because it means, how do you then start to create this kind of fragmented, atomized hospital situation that's spread across large urban centers?
In terms of what we discussed tonight, in general, really, I felt also that the theme of empathy is really important. And Roman Kaczarnik did a great TED Talk and also wrote a book about how we can actually turn empathy into a form of social action. The idea also of empathy being a spark of curiosity. How do you see the importance of empathy for architecture?
I think it's probably one of the most important attributes you can have as an architect, is to be extremely empathetic. And I think it's also something that has to be sort of built into the very DNA of every project we do is the notion of being conscious of the other, conscious of the user, conscious of the, you can extrapolate it from the individual to city space, to communities.
Bernard Stiegler once told me the question is really, how can we be local? Comment peut-on être local sans être localiste? No? So the late philosopher Bernard Stiegler would ask, comment peut-on être local sans être localiste? How can we be local without being localist? And that, of course, has a lot to do with the late Edouard Glissant, the amazing poet and writer, philosopher from Martinique, who was my mentor, with whom I spent a lot of time the last couple of days of, last couple of years actually, of his life. And we actually discussed a few weeks ago with Mantia Diawara, the artist and scholar, about this idea of being rooted, about the local. And that actually, as Diawara says, for Glissant, being rooted in a culture, in a context, is important, but it's only important as long as it does not lead to the exclusion or annihilation of other people's roots, as long as it does not lead to the hierarchization and election of some roots or cultures over others. So Glissant sort of taught us that we need to celebrate roots that expand elsewhere, roots that touch each other. They are not singular roots, they are roots that cover and protect some others. And I think that's a really important point in terms of Glissant, because of course what we could see a lot in the last 12 months are new forms of localism and increased nationalisms. No? So I wanted to ask you about that in relation to architecture.
In my own personal life, my own persona, being born in Cairo, being to a British mother, an Egyptian father, going to school in Algeria and London, in Rome, eventually in Canada and Toronto, and growing up, I think it made me extremely sensitized to local conditions. But it's made me very, very aware of the let's say, the kind of schism and the sort of doubling of local global oscillation, let's say. And I think that the ability to sort of dive in deep locally and understand the best you can philosophically, conceptually, artistically, even scientifically a condition, and at the same time be able to come out of that and look at it with a larger lens and bring to it other attributes from other cultures or other places, and kind of try and find the correct mix is really the key to all of us moving forward in the world.
I remember many years ago, I was in Portugal. I went to see the late architect Guedes, a Portuguese architect who basically was in his late 80s, early 90s, and the majority of his life was active in Africa. And he sort of told me he believes that we need an architecture of open source. He basically said anybody could just come to him, and he sort of would give a scar, he would give a partition, he would sort of give a set of instructions. As you know, it's something I've been very interested in art, because we collaborated on Do It, an exhibition made out of instructions, how-to manuals, recipes. In design, we have, of course, the legendary Enzo Mari, who passed away last year. And I curated a retrospective of his together with Francesca Giacomelli for the Triennale in Milano. Relevant in terms of Mari, of course, also his insistence on long duration, his insistence that, objects have to last because of sustainability. But so important and so relevant for now, of course, his autoprogettazione, where he wanted to transmit knowledge through instructions, and everybody can just build the table or do the table. So I was kind of wondering, it kind of gets us also to the question of open source, because if it's Do It in terms of my exhibition, or if it's Enzo Mari's autoprogettazione, anyone can just do it. And it was very fascinating how actually during the multiple lockdowns of 20 and 21, actually many people started to download again the Do It instruction, just did it, because it sort of liberated them from the 2 dimensions of the screen, and people could just do a Franz West piece or a Louis Bourgeois piece or a Theaster Gates piece in a DIY way, or as a matter of fact, your Do It piece, which you created, which maybe you can tell us about. So I want to ask you, tell us a little bit about that, and about this idea of architecture as open source.
If you and I taught a course on open source cities at that Bauhaus, I would be thrilled. I mean, the idea of actually, and bringing in other experts to actually design templates and notions for the future of our planet and its urbanism is kind of, it's necessary. We need to do it. We need to find, because at the moment, the fiefdoms and the kind of ownership over ideas, and particularly by big tech companies, is kind of is the opposite of what you're talking about, right? Everything is IP, everything is owned, everything is kind of coveted. But the idea that you actually could enter those things into a mix and produce templates for everything from mobility to back to the problem of incarceration, even back to the problem of sort of hospitals. Open source urbanism, open source city design, to me would be, but I guess the reason why it's interesting in the Bauhaus context that you asked about earlier is that as an individual, you can do it. I could sit here and say, okay, you know what, we're gonna design an open source city and just put it out there. But I think if you have it as a kind of a collective, I always was fascinated by a project that I saw as a kid. It was called the Pavilion, and it was built in Expo 67. And I believe that Joseph Beuys was part of it. I believe that Rauschenberg was part of it. And what fascinated me about that pavilion, that project historically, and there were about 25 artists, is that it was an open source, kind of amazing, vibrant vision of the future of architecture and even maybe to some extent art and media with this group of artists, this collective that work together. And I think that it's, we need a pavilion. We need something in this time period where people put down their swords and kind of enter into a place where they can explore the future of our world. Because quite frankly, we're almost in dire need of that now. It's not so much an option. I'll give one small story before I leave you, which is we did a project in Changsha, China, a couple of years ago, maybe 7 years ago now. And it was for a city of the future. That was the commission. We did this project where we got rid of all fossil fuel vehicles, burning vehicles. We got rid of all the sort of, we cleaned it up, and it became a kind of, it was back to Plan Voisin, back to certain ideas about living in nature. Presented it in China, and to make a long story short, we got nothing but silence after the project had been shown. And then 6 months later, we got a call from the client representative, and said, our boss liked your project, but the problem is that he didn't think it looked like a city. And we said, well, what does a city look like? He said, Chicago, we want Chicago. So, I think that tells you a little bit about the issue of building really innovative new environments and open sourcing our information to that level, and getting to that level that's going to hit against, in the private sector at least, resistance by virtue of what people expect from architecture.
Not be a better conclusion, Hani. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Hans. Fantastic to see you.